stayed in a conversation with someone you don't respect, laughed at a joke from someone you find hollow, adjusted your opinion mid-sentence because you felt the room shifting, worked twice as hard to impress someone whose approval, if you're honest, means almost nothing to you, and then drove home wondering why you did it. This isn't about the people you love. It's not about wanting to be seen by the people who matter. That's human, and it makes complete sense. This is about the other ones. The colleague you actively dislike, but whose opinion kept you up last night. The acquaintance you've privately dismissed 100 times, but somehow still dress differently around. The person you know, somewhere underneath it all, doesn't deserve that kind of real estate in your head. And yet there they are. This is one of the most uncomfortable things to admit about yourself, because it doesn't fit the story most of us tell, that we're discerning, that we know who matters, that we don't care what just anyone thinks. The truth is more complicated than that, and it points to something that has nothing to do with the people you're seeking approval from. It never did. Today we're going inside that, not to judge it, but to understand what it's actually about and why the people whose opinions matter least sometimes have the most power over how you feel about yourself. Why would you care what someone thinks if you don't even like them? The logical answer is that you wouldn't. If someone's judgment doesn't mean anything to you, their approval shouldn't either. Their opinion is just noise. You'd register it the way you register weather. Present, neutral, passing. But that's not what happens. What actually happens is closer to the opposite. The person you've privately dismissed, the one you've decided is shallow or difficult or simply not worth your time, has an outsized effect on your emotional state. A comment from them lands harder than it should. A moment of their indifference stings in a way that makes no logical sense. You find yourself recalibrating your behaviour in their presence without consciously deciding to. And if you pay attention to that, really pay attention, without immediately rationalising it away, you start to notice something strange. The people whose approval you work hardest for are often not the people you admire most. They're frequently not the people with the most wisdom or integrity or genuine insight into who you are. They're not the ones whose opinion, if you sat down and thought about it, you would actually trust. They're often the ones who seem most withholding, the ones who don't give it easily, who haven't warmed to you the way others have, who seem slightly unimpressed or distant or harder to read, who give you just enough to keep you reaching but never quite enough to feel settled. And that pattern, the reaching, the recalibrating, the disproportionate attention, is not random. It is not a coincidence. It is not simply a personality quirk. It is a signal, a very specific signal pointing to something that formed long before you ever met the person whose approval you're currently chasing. The psychologist Karen Horney wrote extensively about what she called the search for glory, the compulsive need to prove worth not just to people who matter, but to people who represent a particular kind of threat, the threat of not being enough, the threat of being seen and found lacking. And here is what that means in practice. You don't seek approval from people you don't like because their opinion matters. You seek it because something in you still believes it should. Because somewhere in the architecture of how you learn to move through the world, Approval became currency, and the approval that was hardest to earn, the most conditional, the most uncertain, the most easily withdrawn, became the most valuable. Not because it was worth more, but because it felt most familiar. Here's where it actually starts. Not with the colleague you're trying to impress, not with the acquaintance whose opinion keeps surfacing at 2 a.m. It starts earlier than any of them, earlier than you probably want to go. It starts with the first person whose approval felt uncertain. For most people, that is a parent, or someone in that role, a caregiver, an older sibling, a teacher who held significant weight in the early years, someone whose love was present, but whose approval felt conditional, someone who gave warmth sometimes, and withdrew it at others, without a pattern clear enough for a child to decode. And the child, because this almost always begins in childhood, does what children do with uncertainty. They try harder, they study the signals, they adjust their behaviour, they learn what version of themselves generates warmth and what version generates distance. They develop, without knowing they're developing it, a finely tuned sensitivity to the emotional temperature of the people around them, not because they chose to, but because attachment requires it. When the people you depend on are your entire world, reading them accurately is not optional. It is survival. The problem is what that sensitivity becomes once it's no longer needed for survival. It becomes a default, a way of orienting to every room you walk into, an automatic scan. Who here is pleased with me? Who isn't? Who is withholding something I need to earn? And this is the key that unlocks the whole pattern. The people who feel withholding, the ones who seem slightly unimpressed, whose approval hasn't arrived easily, activate something in the nervous system that is much older than the current situation. They don't just register as people whose opinion you want. They register as something closer to a threat, a familiar threat, the threat of conditional love presenting itself again in a new form. John Bowlby's attachment research showed that the patterns we develop in response to early caregiving don't stay in childhood, they travel. They get applied to new relationships, new contexts, new people who share certain emotional qualities with the original figures. So when you meet someone who is critical or withholding or hard to read, someone whose approval feels uncertain, something in you responds not just to them, it responds to everyone who ever made you feel that earning love required effort. And the effort begins not because you decided to make it, but because the nervous system recognized the shape of the situation and activated the strategy that once, in a very different context, kept you safe. That is not weakness. That is not neediness. That is an adaptation running in the wrong environment. The strategy was built for someone specific, in a specific time, in a specific place. And it has been applying itself ever since to everyone who reminds you of that moment. There's something else happening here that almost never gets named. When you seek approval from someone you don't even like, you are not just trying to win their opinion. You are trying to win an argument, not with them, with yourself. The argument goes something like this. If someone I don't respect approves of me, if even they can see my worth, then the question of my worth is settled. It becomes undeniable, objective, no longer something I have to hold together by myself. through sheer effort and vigilance. Because here is what's underneath the approval seeking, underneath the recalibration, underneath the disproportionate attention to the opinion of someone you'd never call for advice. A question that has never been fully answered. Am I enough? Not in any specific domain. Not professionally, not socially. Not in any category you could measure. Just enough as a person, in the most basic and unqualified sense. And the mind, operating with the logic of someone who never quite received a clear answer to that question, has developed a strategy. Collect evidence, external evidence, from as many sources as possible, including sources you don't particularly trust, because internal certainty has never quite arrived, and maybe enough external confirmation will finally fill the gap. This is the mechanism that makes the approval of people you dislike feel so important. It's not about them. It's about what their approval would prove. Their approval carries a particular weight precisely because they seem unlikely to give it, because they seem demanding or unimpressed or critical. If even they can see it, whatever it is you're trying to prove, then maybe it's finally undeniably true. But here is the problem with that logic. It doesn't work. Not because approval doesn't feel good when it arrives. It does. But the relief it produces is always temporary. The evidence never accumulates into certainty. No matter how much external approval you collect, the internal question remains open, because external approval was never designed to answer an internal question. The gap it's trying to fill was not created by a lack of other people's positive opinions. It was created by something that happened before opinions mattered, before the world had a chance to weigh in at all. And the only thing that can begin to close it is not more evidence from the outside. It's a different relationship with the inside. There's a particular moment that people who carry this recognize. You're in a conversation, a dinner, a meeting, a casual gathering, and someone says something dismissive, not to you directly, just a tone, a look, a comment that lands in a way that shouldn't matter. And something in you shifts, not visibly. You don't react, you keep your composure, continue the conversation, say the right things. But internally something has changed. A low-level alarm has activated. And for the rest of the evening, maybe for the rest of the night, part of your attention is occupied by that moment, analysing it, replaying it, asking what it meant and what you should have said differently, and whether they left with a lower opinion of you than they arrived with. And then, at some point, you catch yourself and you remember that you don't even like this person, that their opinion, in the cold light of examination, doesn't hold particular weight, that you wouldn't seek their counsel on anything that mattered, and you feel something close to embarrassment, not at them, at yourself. This is one of the most disorienting experiences the approval pattern produces, because it reveals, briefly and uncomfortably, the gap between who you think you are, someone discerning, someone who knows what matters, and how you actually respond in the moment. The psychologist Nathaniel Branden wrote about what he called the disowned self. The parts of ourselves we haven't integrated, the needs we haven't acknowledged, the wounds we haven't named, don't disappear. They operate from outside our awareness. They shape behaviour before we have a chance to consciously choose it. And the approval seeking from people we don't like is one of the clearest expressions of the disowned self in action. Because consciously, You don't want their approval. You know it doesn't matter. You have decided intellectually that they are not worth the energy. But something underneath the conscious decision has a different agenda. Something that hasn't yet received what it was originally looking for is still looking, still scanning, still responding to the shape of the situation with the strategy it developed a long time ago. And it doesn't check with you first, it just runs. The gap between who you consciously believe yourself to be and how this pattern makes you behave is not evidence of hypocrisy. It is evidence of something unfinished, something that was never fully resolved because it was never fully seen. And seeing it clearly, without flinching, without immediately turning away, is the first thing that has to happen before anything else can. So what does it look like to actually work with this? Not to eliminate it. That is not realistic and probably not even desirable, but to loosen its grip, to create enough space between the trigger and the response that choice becomes possible. It begins with something that sounds almost too simple. Noticing, not analysing, not immediately tracing the behaviour back to childhood and constructing a narrative about what it means, just in the moment or shortly after. Noticing what happened. I sought approval from someone I don't respect. I adjusted my behaviour in response to someone whose judgment I don't trust. I let someone I've privately dismissed occupy significant space in my mind. Just that. Without the immediate rush to explain it or justify it or feel ashamed of it, because shame is the thing that makes this pattern most invisible. The embarrassment of recognising it, the dissonance between the self-image and the behaviour, tends to produce one of two responses. Either immediate rationalisation, which buries the pattern back under a layer of explanation, or harsh self-criticism, which focuses energy on the judgment of the behaviour rather than the understanding of it. Neither of those produces change. What produces change is curiosity. When you catch the pattern running, when you notice the disproportionate attention, the recalibration, the reaching for approval from someone who doesn't deserve it, the question that shifts something is not why am I like this or what is wrong with me. It is what was I just looking for, not rhetorically, as a genuine inquiry. What would their approval have given me in that moment if it had arrived? What would I have felt? What would it have meant? And if you sit with that question honestly, which is uncomfortable, which is why most people don't, what usually surfaces is something older than the situation, something that precedes the person you were trying to impress, a feeling of not being quite enough that has been there for a long time. And recognizing that feeling, not fixing it, not immediately doing something about it, just recognizing it, creates a small but significant shift, because suddenly the behavior makes sense, not as a flaw, not as evidence of some fundamental inadequacy, but as the logical output of a system that is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is seeking something it was never fully given, and it is looking for it in all the wrong places, because the right place, inside, in the relationship with oneself, is the last place a person trained on external approval thinks to look. Jung called this the work of individuation, the slow, non-linear process of withdrawing the projections, the needs, the wounds, the unresolved questions that we place onto the people around us and beginning to meet them inside ourselves. It doesn't happen quickly, it doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't mean you stop caring what anyone thinks. It means you start caring about the right things for the right reasons. Not because approval has arrived from enough external sources, but because something internal has shifted enough that the constant search for it begins, slowly to ease. If you've stayed with me through all of this, I want to pause here for a moment, because what we've been covering today is the kind of thing most people sense but never say out loud. Not because it isn't true, but because admitting it requires a certain honesty about the gap between who we think we are and how we actually behave. That gap is uncomfortable, but it is also where all the real work happens. If this channel is a place where that kind of honesty feels possible, subscribe. Not as a reflex, but because this is what we do here, consistently, without flinching. We go into the places that are easy to avoid. We name the things that usually stay unnamed. If that's what you're looking for, stay with us. Now, before we close, I want to say one more thing. Something that I think matters more than anything else we've covered today. We've talked about where the approval seeking comes from. We've traced the pattern back to its origins. We've looked at the mechanism, the way a question that was never fully answered keeps generating behavior long after the original context is gone. But there's something underneath all of that, something that the pattern, in its most relentless moments, is trying to tell you. Not about the people whose approval you're chasing, about the relationship you have with yourself. Because here is what chronic approval seeking ultimately reveals. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being your own witness. You outsourced the job of deciding your worth to the reactions of people around you. And once that outsourcing happened, once the internal sense of value became dependent on external confirmation, the search became endless. Because external confirmation is always conditional, always temporary, always subject to withdrawal. And a sense of worth that can be withdrawn is not a sense of worth at all. It is a performance, maintained at enormous cost, in front of an audience that keeps changing, including sometimes an audience you don't even respect. The question isn't how to stop caring what people think. The question is how to become, again, your own most reliable witness. Becoming your own witness doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others. It doesn't mean arriving at a place where feedback doesn't land, where criticism slides off, where other people's perceptions simply don't register. That kind of detachment is not health. It is a different kind of disconnection. What it means is something more precise. It means developing an internal relationship, stable enough that the external one no longer has to do all the work. It means having a place inside yourself that you can return to. Not a place of certainty, not a place where all the hard questions are answered, but a place that is genuinely yours. That knows what you value and why. That can hold a critical opinion without collapsing and a positive one without inflating. That doesn't need to be confirmed from the outside in order to feel real. That place is built slowly, through the accumulation of small, honest acts, through noticing the pattern and staying with the discomfort instead of immediately redirecting it outward, through asking again and again what you actually think before you check what everyone else thinks, through allowing your own experience to be valid before you look for someone else to validate it. None of this is quick. None of it is linear. There will be moments, many moments, when the old pattern runs anyway. When someone whose opinion shouldn't matter is suddenly occupying the center of your attention and you can't fully explain why. Those moments are not failures. They are information. They are the pattern making itself visible enough to be worked with. And over time, not through discipline or willpower, but through genuine understanding, something begins to change. Not that the approval stops feeling good when it arrives. It still does. But it stops feeling necessary. It stops carrying the weight of the original question. It becomes what it always should have been. One piece of information among many, offered by a person whose opinion you may or may not find useful, landing without the old charge of proof or disproof. The people who don't matter start to take up less space, not because you became indifferent to them, but because the question they were being asked to answer has begun to find a different home. And the people who actually matter, the ones with real insight, real integrity, real knowledge of who you are, their words start to land differently, with more weight, with more truth, because you're no longer filtering everything through the desperate need for confirmation. You're listening, actually listening, not for evidence that you're enough, but because you're genuinely curious about what they see. That shift, quiet, gradual, without announcement, is what it looks like when the approval seeking begins to ease, not because the wound disappeared, but because you finally stopped asking strangers to heal it. If this video reached something real in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not broadly. Think of one person, the one who you sense is working too hard for the wrong audience. Send it to them without explanation. They'll know. Leave a comment below. Tell me where this landed. Tell me about the person whose approval you've been chasing without quite knowing why. Or tell me what you want us to go deeper on next. This channel exists because of that conversation. I'll see you in the next one.